This is the entire story of England, from a ring of standing stones older than the pyramids of Egypt to an empire that once touched a quarter of the planet to the rain-washed island you can stand on today. And the strangest thread running through all of it is how many times this place very nearly didn't survive to become any of those things. Using artificial intelligence trained on centuries of paintings, illuminated manuscripts, and weathered stone, we rebuild these lost worlds frame by frame so you can breathe their air. A hard wind crosses an open plain in the south of the island 5,000 years ago, and a line of people are hauling a single stone that weighs as much as 4 elephants. They have no metal tools, no written word. The smaller blue stones at the heart of their great circle were carried somehow all the way from the hills of West Wales, 150 miles on foot by hand. We call the place Stonehenge, and the honest truth is we still cannot tell you for certain what it was for. A temple, a calendar of the sun, a doorway for those they had lost. What we do know is that it was already old beyond memory when the next chapter came ashore. By the time the first Romans set foot here, this was a land of tribes, of hill forts ringed in timber, of people the Romans named the Britons, and they had no interest whatsoever in being conquered. Julius Caesar tried first, in 55 before the Common Era. He crossed the Channel, took one long look, and more or less left again. It took another 100 years for the Emperor Claudius to make it stick, in 43 of the Common Era. The legions waded ashore, and within a single generation, roads ran straight as a blade across the hills, and a small trading post on a muddy river was given a name: Londinium. The island did not go quietly. Around the year 60, a queen of the eastern tribes named Boudica, say it Boudica, rose against Rome after she and her family were wronged and her people stripped of everything. What came next shook the empire to its bones. Her forces turned 3 Roman cities to ash, the young Londinium among them. Roman writers claimed 70,000 of their own were lost. The real figure is gone forever. Her rising failed in the end. But Rome never quite forgot how close it had come out here on the wet green edge of the world. 3 more centuries the Romans held on, and they left their fingerprints on everything: the straight road, the hot bath, the very notion of a city. Far in the north, they raised a wall of stone clean across the island, 73 miles of it, to hold back the tribes they could never tame. You can still walk Hadrian's Wall, your palm flat against the same cold stone a soldier touched 1,800 years ago. And then, around 410, with their own empire buckling, the Romans simply left. A letter went home telling the Britons to defend themselves now. The lights of a whole civilization went out, one town at a time. Into that darkness came the sails. Across the North Sea they rode, Angles, Saxons and Jutes from the cold coasts of what we now call Germany and Denmark. The Britons called them raiders. History would call their descendants the English. They cut the land into a quilt of small, quarrelsome kingdoms, and deep in the soil of the east, one of their kings was laid to rest inside an entire ship, dragged up from the river and buried whole, heaped with gold, and crowned with a war helmet of breathtaking, eyeless beauty. We uncovered it in 1939, at a place called Sutton, just days before the modern world fell into war once more. That iron face is now the portrait of an entire vanished age. On a June morning in 793, long ships appeared off the holy island of Lindisfarne, and a new terror began. The Vikings had found England. For the better part of a century, they came back every season, until it looked as though the whole island would simply become another Scandinavian shore. One man refused to let it. His name was Alfred, king of the southern realm of Wessex, and he is the only ruler in all of English history we still call the Great. There is a beloved old legend that, hiding in the marshes at his lowest point, he was scolded by a peasant woman for letting her cakes burn, a king so lost in worry he forgot the bread. Whether it happened or not, the truth behind it is real. Alfred came back from nothing. In 878, he turned the tide against the Viking leader Guthrum, and he did something cleverer than any battle. He began to build the idea of a single English people, with one law, one language, and a string of fortified towns. Some of those street plans still shape English towns today. His grandson, Aethelstan, would finish the dream and become, in the 900s, the first man to rule all of England as one. I find that genuinely moving, a country talked into existence by a man who started out hiding in a swamp, and here is where I will plant my flag. In the year 1016, a Danish king named Cnut took the English throne, and there is a famous story that, tired of courtiers swearing the sea itself would obey him, he had his chair carried to the shore and ordered the tide to halt, purely to watch it soak his royal feet and prove them all fools. A king staging a public stunt to embarrass his own yes-men might be the most relatable thing in this entire video. If you reckon Cnut was the smartest king on this list for that move, do tap the like. And if you think a man arguing with the ocean had clearly lost the plot, the comments are right there waiting for you. Because nothing on this island stayed settled for long. In 1066 came the year that broke English history in two. The old king, Edward the Confessor, left no son. Harold Godwinson, an English earl, took the crown in January. He barely had time to wear it. That autumn, he marched the length of the country to throw back one invader in the north, won, and then turned and marched straight back south, because a far greater threat had landed on the coast of Sussex. Duke William of Normandy, who believed the English throne was his. They met near a town now simply called Battle on the 14th of October. For most of a long day, the English line held the high ground and would not break. The light is failing. The English wall is bending, and then it breaks. Harold fell, and with him fell Anglo-Saxon England. The whole terrible day is stitched into 70 meters of embroidered cloth we call the Bayeux Tapestry, a comic strip 9 centuries old and still one of our finest windows onto that afternoon. William the Conqueror remade everything. He handed the land to his own followers, raised stone castles to pin the country down, and in 1086 ordered a survey so total in counting every field, ox and household that the English bitterly nicknamed it the Domesday Book, the Book of Judgment, from which there was no appeal. That book still survives, and you can look up villages in it that are still lived in today. He even changed the way we speak. Half the grand words in English, government, justice, beef, courage, sailed in with the Normans. The very word curfew comes from their order to cover the fire at night. The new dynasty almost ended in a single night. In 1120, the only lawful son and heir of King Henry I boarded a fast, fashionable vessel called the White Ship to cross from France. The crew had been celebrating. The ship struck a rock just outside the harbour and went down, taking the heir with it. They say the king never smiled again. And the loss of that one young man plunged England into nearly 20 years of grinding civil war over who should rule. Out of all that chaos came one of the most important moments in the whole story of human freedom. In 1215, a deeply unpopular king named John had so angered his barons that they cornered him in a meadow called Runnymede beside the River Thames and forced him to set his seal to a charter limiting his own power. We call it Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Most of it was about medieval squabbles long forgotten. But one idea inside it never left us: that even a king is not above the law. That single thought would echo all the way to courtrooms and constitutions on the far side of the world. In the autumn of 1348, the ships brought something that did not care who was king. A great pestilence swept up from the ports, carried by fleas on the rats in the holds of trading vessels, and within 2 years it had taken somewhere between a third and a half of everyone in England. Sit with that. In some villages, you could walk down the lane and 1 in every 2 faces you passed by spring would be gone. Whole hamlets emptied and were never lived in again. You can still find their faint green outlines in the fields. And here is the twist the survivors never saw coming. With so few left to work the land, those who remained could suddenly demand wages and walk away from cruel masters. The rigid old order cracked. Out of the worst catastrophe England had ever known, ordinary people quietly gained a sliver of power they would never fully surrender. For more than 100 years, English kings poured men and money into a bitter struggle with France over a claim to its throne, the 100 Years' War. They won famous victories and lost them all again until nothing remained but pride and debt. A kingdom with nothing left to fight abroad turned on itself. The crown split between 2 branches of the royal family, one wearing a red rose, one a white, the houses of Lancaster and York, and for 30 years they tore the throne back and forth in what we call the Wars of the Roses. It ended on a field at Bosworth in 1485, where the last York king, Richard III, lost his crown and his life, and a Welshman named Henry Tudor picked it up. Here is the part that still makes me grin. For more than 5 centuries, nobody knew where Richard's grave was. In 2012, archaeologists finally found his lost remains in the city of Leicester, beneath a council car park, almost exactly under a painted parking bay that, of all the letters in the alphabet, happened to be marked with an R. I have tried for years to picture the moment that turned up under the tarmac, and I still can't quite do it justice. If your imagination is sharper than mine, set that scene for me in the comments. I will read everyone. The man who knelt at Bosworth rose as Henry VII, first of the Tudors, and his son became the most famous king England ever had. Henry VIII wanted a male heir and a wife the Pope would not let him marry, so he did something earth-shaking. He broke England away from the Church of Rome entirely, made himself head of a new English church, and shut down the monasteries that had run the country's faith for 1,000 years. Their roofless skeletons still stand in green valleys across England, beautiful and silent. His warship, the Mary Rose, rolled over and sank in 1545, and 4.5 centuries later, in 1982, we raised her from the seabed, a whole Tudor world lifted dripping into the light. His daughter became the giant of the age. Elizabeth I never married, ruled for 44 years, and steered a small broke island into a golden age. In 1588, the mightiest power on earth, Spain, sent a vast armada of 130 ships to crush her. Storms and a nimble English fleet scattered it around the coasts of Britain. The island that should have fallen didn't. And in the noise and mud of Elizabeth's London, a glover's son from Stratford named William Shakespeare was writing plays in a wooden theatre on the Thames. Words so alive that 400 years on, we still quote him every day without realizing it. When Elizabeth passed with no child of her own, the crown did something extraordinary. It travelled north and brought the King of Scotland, James, down to rule England too, joining 2 old enemies under one head for the first time. 2 years into his English reign, a band of plotters packed a cellar beneath Parliament with barrels of gunpowder, meaning to blow the king and his lords sky high. They were caught in the small hours of the 5th of November, 1605. England has lit bonfires on that date every year since, a 400-year-old grudge we now celebrate with toffee apples and fireworks. James's son, Charles I, believed God himself had handed him the right to rule alone, and Parliament disagreed so violently that the kingdom fell into civil war. After years of fighting, the unthinkable happened. Charles was put on trial by his own people, the verdict went against him, and in 1649, England did what no nation had dared. It removed its anointed king and abolished the monarchy outright. For 11 strange years, there was no crown at all, only a stern soldier-statesman named Oliver Cromwell, ruling as Lord Protector, who famously banned the festivities of Christmas as sinful frivolity. The English put up with that for about a decade before quietly inviting the royal family back. The restored capital then took 2 blows in 2 years. In 1665, plague returned and emptied London once more. And in the early hours of the 2nd of September 1666, a fire started in the shop of a baker named Thomas Farriner on a lane called Pudding Lane. It should have been nothing. Instead, a dry summer and a strong wind turned it into an inferno that ate the medieval city for 4 days, taking 13,000 houses and old St. Paul's Cathedral with it. A clerk named Samuel Pepys, watching in horror, ran into his garden and buried his prized wine and a whole wheel of Parmesan cheese to save them from the flames, which is the most human detail in this entire story, and I love him for it. The architect Christopher Wren then rebuilt St. Paul's into the great domed cathedral that still crowns London's skyline today. 22 years later, in 1688, England changed its king almost without a fight, inviting a Dutch prince, William of Orange, to take the throne and bind the monarchy forever beneath the law of Parliament. They called it the Glorious Revolution, and in 1707, England and Scotland formally became one country, Great Britain. What that new nation did next changed the entire planet. In the smoke of its northern towns, England built the world's first industrial revolution. Steam engines, iron mills and railways pouring out of cities like Manchester and Birmingham. For the first time, a society ran on machines instead of the muscle of man and beast. The air thickened to coal smoke and the rivers ran filthy, but the power it unleashed was staggering. And on the back of that power, a small island assembled the largest empire the world has ever seen. At its height, the British Empire ruled roughly a quarter of all the land on Earth and a quarter of all its people, so vast that the sun was always shining on some corner of it. Over this peak presided a tiny woman in black, Queen Victoria, woken as an 18-year-old girl in the summer of 1837 to be told she was now queen. She would reign for 63 years and give her name to an entire age of invention, ambition, and deep contradiction, a century of dazzling progress built far too often on the hardship of others. And I won't pretend that part of the story sits easily with me. The new century opened in confidence and then walked straight into catastrophe. In 1914, England and its empire were pulled into the First World War, and over 4 years close to 1 million British men did not come home from the fields of France and Belgium. A whole generation was thinned in the mud. The grief was so total that the country still falls silent every November, wearing a single red poppy to remember them. I have stood inside one of those 2-minute silences. You can hear an entire nation hold its breath. Barely 20 years later, it happened again, and this time the danger came for the island itself. In the summer of 1940, after most of Europe had fallen, Britain stood almost entirely alone. Through that autumn, enemy aircraft pounded London for 57 nights without a single break. In the ordeal, Londoners simply called the Blitz. Families slept in the underground stations as the city shook above their heads. A defiant Prime Minister named Winston Churchill put iron into the nation's spine with nothing but words and a radio. The island held again. Out of the exhaustion of victory, England built something it had never had before. In 1948, the country created the National Health Service, care for everyone, free at the point of need, paid for by all. An idea still fiercely loved across Britain today. The great empire, though, was finished. One by one, its territories became free nations, and the island that had ruled a quarter of the globe quietly handed it back. Through all of it stood one remarkable constant. In 1952, a young woman of 25 became Queen Elizabeth II, and she would reign for 70 years, the longest of any monarch in English history, a steady figure through 15 prime ministers and a world utterly transformed. 70 years. A great many people alive today have never known another face on the throne. In 2016, Britain made one of the most divisive choices of modern times, voting by a narrow margin, 52 to 48, to leave the European Union, and formally departing in 2020 after more than 4 decades of membership. 2 years later, in 2022, the long Elizabethan age came to its quiet end, and for the first time in 70 years, England woke to a king once more, Charles III. And that brings us, at last, to today, to an island in the year 2026 that has been a forest and a frontier, a Roman colony and a Viking shore, a feudal kingdom and a global empire, and is now something it has never quite been before. An old, weathered, deeply human country, still arguing with itself about what it wants to be next. We are the team behind Edward Resurrects History, and pulling these 5,000 years back into the light has been the great joy of our work. If something in this long walk through England moved you, a queen in the ash, a baker in the dark, a king beneath a parking space, tell us which moment caught you and which forgotten corner of the past we should bring back next. Subscribe and walk the centuries with us. From standing stones to a steady throne, this small grey island never stopped becoming. And somehow, against all of it, it endures still.